Our clinician today is going to be Keith Pashina. And you probably remember Keith gave us a presentation, I think it was in May of this year, on the his layout, and he models the Gilpin Tram, and that is the subject of his talk today. Keith became interested in the Gilpin Tram in 1986. He was originally attracted by the unique ore cars that they had on the railroad, and it was during the National Narrow Gauge Convention in Denver that year. He managed to hike a portion of the grade and became immediately fascinated by the steepness of the grades and the numerous spurs heading off to the many mines in the area. Several friends shared information with him, and he began lurking in the museums, and sooner or later he became an expert on himself. And so with that introduction, let me turn this presentation over to Keith Pashina. Thank you, Keith.
I'm going to talk about the Gilpin Tram tonight, which is, as Pete mentioned, it's just I think it's a fascinating little 2-foot gauge line in Colorado. It was probably the largest 2-foot line west of Maine, basically. And it's so unlike many of the narrow gauges we often look at and think of. And I'll show you examples of that. So tonight, I was going to first give you a brief overview of what the railroad was and what they did. And then we'll take a tour over the main line and just show you a lot of the towns, mines, and right away to give you more of a flavor for what the railroad actually was. This picture here, I think, gives a good representation of what the Gilpin Tram was. This is down in the north end of Blackhawk, and we see kind of in the back left center, that's the engine house. They always called it a roundhouse, but of course it was a converted livery stable. There's a couple ore cars sitting on a trestle there. That trestle is actually the main line that just kind of hooked around the engine house and up one of the gulches. So kind of interesting and characteristic of the Gilpin Tram, whereby they did not put a lot of effort or great expense into right away. They followed the terrain pretty closely. Also, front and center, we see 3 Shay locomotives, and that's the only motive power the Gilpin Tram ever used, Shays. And what's better than, for a modeler or hobbyist than a bunch of 2-foot gauge Shays? We also see kind of little hints of, like, off in the back, the right background, there's some other rolling stock there. Right behind the right-hand locomotive there's a excursion car. We'll talk about that in a bit. And just in front, there's just all kinds of interesting pieces laying around. You can see the track work is not, the right-of-way is not overly ballasted or anything. And it's just a fascinating thing to study. Now, to be clear on where was the Gilpin Tram, the red line shows the Colorado and Southern Forks, Clear Creek lines. And the lower line, of course, ran up to Idaho Springs and eventually Georgetown Loop and so on. The branch going off to the top of the screen went up to Blackhawk, and then there was a switchback up to Central City. Well, this branch served Gilpin County. It's the smallest county in the state, but it was a very rich mining county in its day. So the Gilpin Tram was built to convey these gold ores down to the mills, which were down basically at the bottom of the hill along Clear Creek and Blackhawk. So the blue line shows kind of the general area where the Gilpin Tram ran. And you can see it's roughly about a large half circle just kind of hooking around Central City. This location's maybe an hour west of Denver, pretty close, but yet back in railroad days, 140 years ago, this was some distance away, and railroads were definitely needed to get there. The Gilpin Tram had about a 30-year life. They started operations in 1887. They were abandoned in early 1917. But during that time, they were very prolific in the county. They had branches, spurs seemingly all over the place, and they were built for one purpose, and that's to carry the gold ores from the mines down to the mills. And the reason for that was this was a maturing mining district. So the very rich surface ores were, of course, long gone, and the mines became deeper, plenty of ore, but the ore had less gold and other metal content than before. Hence, you had lower grade ore, and you needed something much heavier duty than horse wagons and teams to carry it down, and the railroad was the answer. By being a 2-foot gauge line, they could build relatively inexpensively and reach a lot of the mines. So here is Shay number 3 at the California mine, and coupled behind it, you can see a couple of the ore cars already loaded with gold ore. Here's an example of another one of the big producers. In the right foreground, we see the iron mine, and in the back is the Pewabic mine. Iron mine, don't confuse that with iron ore. It was a gold and precious metal operation. But this particular mine, back in its heyday, say the early 1900s, would ship out maybe 8 to 10 cars of ore each day. And this was adjacent to several other large producers on this particular mountain. And so the Gilpin Tram would have up to 30 car ore trains. They were probably shorter most of the time, but that's pretty good size for a 2-foot gauge line. We see probably the mining crew for the Pewabic or iron mine in front posing for the camera, but behind them we see 2 tracks, one with loaded ore cars and the other with some empties waiting to be loaded. Here's down in Blackhawk. This is kind of the more the north end of the mining district. So we're maybe a half-mile north of downtown Blackhawk, if you want to call it that. And this shows what was one of the major mines, the Hidden Treasure Mill. The Shay number 2 of the Gilpin Tram is going by in front of it and taking empty ore cars eventually back up to the mines. You'll notice in this presentation, a lot of the photos I show might be a little blurry or not all that great. And that's a frustrating thing about the Gilpin Trams. There's some great photographs. There's a lot of things that were never photographed, and there's other things that were photographed not real well. So we take whatever we can get when you follow this line. An interesting point about this mill, that big box here, it says Hidden Treasure Mill on it. That was a large water wheel. Most of these mills were pretty thrifty, and that they would use water wheels to power the mills when the creek was running high. And then when the water started running lower, they would switch over to steam boilers fueled by coal to do that. One other interesting point, this is about the north end of the Colorado and Southern. There was a lot of dual gauge, and we'll see examples of that. But kind of lower right center, you can see one of the Colorado and Southern coal cars sitting there, probably had been unloading coal to the mill. At the south end of the Blackhawk milling district was probably the biggest producer of ore concentrates. That's the Iron City Mill. As an example of that upper track is the Gilpin Tram that Shay is pushing back about at least 20 ore cars for unloading into this mill. This mill started out as a much smaller mill, just added onto over the years until it reach this final configuration. And down in front, of course, we see the Colorado and Southern has a spur here where they're loading some, a couple spurs really, loading ore concentrates. The main line into Blackhawk actually ran on the other side of Clear Creek here, which you can see on the right side of the photo. And then another important part, kind of the heart of the milling district in a way, was this area. We see several stacks, and these all represent various ore mills or foundries or a power plant serving Blackhawk. In front, we see a trestle, that's 2-foot gauge Gilpin Tram. The branch off to the right is serving the Polar Star Mill, and the Polar Star Mill was in its day a pretty active Gilpin customer. In fact, if you go to Blackhawk today, it's the only surviving mill that was served by the Gilpin Tram. So it's right next to the highway. You can't miss it. And what's the focus of my interest here is on that trestle, that little spur off to the left. That's what they called chutes, or for ore chutes. And what they could do is park 2 ore cars there. There's a simple chute that would then directly dump into a Colorado and Southern 3-foot gauge coal car. And the ore chutes were used for the higher grade ore that was good enough to go directly to a smelter, whereas everything else they were hauling was lower grade and had to be concentrated first in an ore mill. Also, to the left of the chutes, we see some trackage. there's some dual gauge, that's dual gauge meaning 2-foot and 3-foot track down there. And this was a very important point, and we'll see more of this in upcoming photos. Here's a map showing, I labeled it all-time trackage, and of course I made some mistakes and left off a couple spurs and one branch, but forgive me for that. But basically, Blackhawk is kind of up there in the upper right corner, and that's where the milling district was. And the railroad then made almost like a half circle to get to all the mills, the mines to serve the mills that were very active at the time. At its peak, it had about 26.5 miles of track. A large percentage of that was spurs and branches. In fact, off the main line, there were 11 different branches built at various times. Not all of them were in operation at the same time. A lot of track would tend to come and go as a mine, produced or did not produce. And at times the Gilpin would even tear up unused spurs and branches in order to lay new track to more active mines. So quite a lot of activity going on there in that 30-year period. I mentioned it was a Shea powered railroad, and this is their first Shea that they acquired in 1887. Shea number 1 was a construction number 181 and 2-cylinder locomotive. You can see the crew pretty proud of their steed right there. And it looks like they're pushing a flat car of cross ties. So perhaps this is during the construction period, because that's when construction began on the Gilpin Tram. As they grew, they acquired 2 more locomotives. And in this area, we see Shea number 1 on the left and Shea number 3 on the right. And they're pushing their one piece of snow fetting equipment, plow number 2. There was not a plow number 1, as far as I could tell, and just a simple 2-axle car for bucking snow. An interesting thing about these Shea locomotives, when you look at them, they were modified a lot over time. I'm backing up to the first photo, Shea number 1, and the cab is very open and has a capped stack. You look at Shea number 1 on the left there, you can see we have a straight stack, and the cab has been modified. Same thing with Shea number 3 here on the right. We see there's a straight stack, and we look at a photo a little bit later, we see now we have a small diamond stack. So depending on the year you're trying to model, you're going to find all kinds of varied details on these Sheas. The fireman standing there in the cab steps there is holding his banjo or coal shovel. If you remember that song, I've been working on the railroad, there's part of one of the verses, strumming on my old banjo. Well, that was kind of just kind of an old joke or whatever back in the day, another name for a coal scoop. So they're kind of goofing off here. This is maybe up on Quartz Hill, one of the rich mining districts, and you see all kinds of buildings and mines in the background, and several of those would have been served by the Gilpin Tram. As the railroad grew, the locomotives grew, and this is their last locomotive, Shea number 5. The first 3 were acquired pretty quickly in the life of the Gilpin. And then after about a 10-year period, around 1900, Shea number 4 was purchased. And then a couple years later, Shea number 5 was purchased. By then, the first 2 locomotives were too small for the line, really, and probably worn out to some extent. So they were sold off to the Silver City, Pinos Altos, and Mogollon line in New Mexico. And so the Gilpin Tram had just kept the 3 larger Sheas at that time. In fact, they probably never really had more than 3 active Sheas running at any one time. It just depended on what year and what size locomotive they'd be using. Now, this photo shows a typical ore car, and I think most of us are all familiar with these. If nothing else, these cars are probably one of the best known attributes of the Gilpin Tram, and there's been models produced and they show up in a lot of photos. And this is probably at the builder, Lima Machine Works there in Ohio. And what's interesting about these cars is their simplicity. You see these wood beams, on the ends. They do not extend through the body of the car at all. It's basically a metal bin with drop doors on the bottom, and the end platforms are bolted to each end. And there's handbrakes over each truck. They never had air brakes, never got any more complicated than this. Now, Dan Abbott, in his Gilpin Tram era book, researched these pretty extensively, and I think he found there's maybe 7 or 8 distinct groups of ore cars, and some of the early ones were actually modified over time as well. This car had about a 10 cord capacity, which equates to somewhere between 9 and 10 tons of ore. And this was their standard, and they had about 138 cars at one time. Here we're looking at a train going up, straight up Winnebago Hill, and you can see the cars behind it, they're all sagging a little bit. And this was probably a common problem with that construction. Remember, the platforms are just bolted to the metal bin. And so there's kind of a sag that shows up in a lot of these photos. The Gilpin Tram had more than just ore cars, but it's predominantly ore cars. And this family is enjoying maybe a Sunday afternoon picnic or whatever. And in the background, we see in the center that's not a shed, that's their first caboose, very simple affair. We see an excursion car over, upper left. And there's also, you can kind of make out maybe a couple of the coal cars. And we'll see more examples of this as I move along. The Gilpin roster is pretty simple. I mentioned the Shea locomotives. They had 5 total, but never more than 3 in service at one time. They had 3 cabooses, and the cabooses didn't probably come on board till 1906. That's when the Colorado and Southern purchased the Gilpin Tram, and they probably became a little more formal, or maybe one of the officials was horrified at everyone just kind of rode out in the open on cars. But they had 3 cabooses, probably 2 in service at any one time. One of them was pretty extensively damaged and scrapped. They had up to 138 ore cars, maybe not exact number in service all at the same time, but records show that they had a lot of ore cars. There was 9 coal cars, basically, call them gondolas. They were, a typical one was 20 feet long, rather short. They had flat cars, of course, needed just for carrying bridge timbers, building supplies, whatever. Originally they had 6 excursion cars, and they're shown there, 3 of them in the lower left photo. But I saw a record where within 2 years after construction, basically Gilpin Tram asked Union Pacific to quit selling excursion tickets. They were getting out of that business, and getting down to hauling ore. So the 5 extra excursion cars were presumably converted to coal cars. And notice that middle photo on the right. I don't know much about it, but it looks like it's one of the excursion cars, and it's converted to maybe a work caboose or something. They put wood ends on it. There's a smokestack, and I don't know anything further about it, but it's an intriguing car. They had a water car, which was carrying water to some of the mines that had very poor water for the boilers. They had a rail and boiler car. There's a diagram showing it, but no photos exist that I know of. And we already saw snowplow number 2. Now, if you're interested in the Gilpin Tram and you want to find out more, there's some really good sources out there. The best one is the Gilpin Railroad Era by Dan Abbott and Del McCoy. And that is really the book to get. That has everything you want to know about the Gilpin Tram. There's been some equipment folios put out from Colorado and Southern days that give good basic dimensions on the rolling stock. Mallory Hope Farrell had the Gilpin Gold Tram book in the 1970s. That's a very good read. It does not have as much information as the Gilpin Railroad Era, probably because Dan Abbott had the advantage of another 40 years of research to publish. And that top little yellow book is from the mid-1950s by Frank Hollenbach. And that's a really good book. It's full of some great information. And you can find it on the internet, used copies pretty inexpensively. So it's worth looking for. And of course, Gazette is a great source. There's all kinds of ongoing articles and models by various people, including me, on that. Now that we've taken a brief overview look of the Gilpin Tram, I think it'd be fun to take a tour over the main line. And since this is a presidential election year, I thought we'll retrace the route of the Democrat Party excursion that occurred in 1908. In that year, William Jennings Bryan was the Democrat Party candidate. They had their national convention in Denver. And one day, according to the newspapers, about 600 conventioneers took a Colorado and Southern train up to Blackhawk, where they got off, toured at least one of the mills, looked around town, and then they rode the main line of the Gilpin Tram. So we're going to retrace the route. There's really only about 3, maybe 4 photos of the actual excursion. So I'm going to substitute a lot of others in there, but that may be more interesting. But we're down here in Blackhawk, and we're right in front of the ore chutes. They would be they're out of view, but they'd be off to the left. And you can see in the very lower left corner, there's a hint of some of that dual gauge track. And what they did was pretty simple. They took their coal cars and the one excursion car and put bench seats in the coal cars, and that's how they hauled everybody up. And they used bunting, decorative bunting, pretty extensively, including on the locomotive. This is a pretty cool shot. That building on the very right margin is kind of a landmark, and we'll see that in a couple other photos to kind of help you identify where this photo was taken. This is the same map I've shown you before, and the red line traces the route of the Democrat Party excursion. And what they did was they followed the main line up to Pewabic Mountain. Pewabic Mountain at the time probably had the largest producing mines. And there was an nice open area there where they paused for lunches and speeches. Then they all got back on the train, went up about another mile and a half to a scenic view near the Frontenac mine. The Frontenac mine was the original end of track. Of course, that was later extended to reach more mines. But once they had seen the scenic view, then they all returned back to Blackhawk and took the train back to Denver. Must have been a really fun day. I wish people would have taken more photos, or more photos would have survived. But off we go. Again, I don't apologize for this photo. This was out of a newspaper. I've never seen a glass plate or a better print of this, but this shows probably what the Democrat Party excursion might have looked like. This is labeled a banker's excursion on a different date, but it probably looked very similar. We're down in Blackhawk, right by the ore chutes. That building I pointed out is kind of top center. It's kind of it's a livery stable or barn. And we see in the center of the photo, one of the shays coupled to the one excursion car. And then we have a bunch of coal cars with bunting, decorative bunting, and more bench seats. So the Democrat Party conventioneers would have been loaded into a similar train and started upgrade up to the mines. And this is a nice photo because it's an on-site view of those ore chutes. I mean, there's not even an ore bin there. It's simply a metal chute. You would pop open the bottom dump doors in the car, and all 10 tons would go sliding into a Colorado and Southern car. Very simple, but it worked for them. And in front, we see one of the 20-foot Gilpin Tram coal cars, and kind of idea how those cars were loaded. Must have been a cozy ride. And here the photographer climbed up the mountain, looked down on the same ore chutes. Here's the ore chute structure here about the center. There's one ore car there. And then down to the left of it, we see some loaded Gilpin Tram cars. And right between them and the elevated track area are Colorado and Southern coal cars, or gondolas, whatever you want to call them, waiting to get ore loaded. And there was some dual gauge track here, and that connected to a dual gauge transfer yard, which we'll look at next. This map is from a Colorado and Southern official map, and just an enlargement of part of it. It kind of gives you an idea of how the track was laid out. It followed, of course, the narrow bottom of Clear Creek, and the blue colored area is the Polar Star Mill we saw, and just to the left of it, we can see where the ore chutes are. The coal and freight transfer tracks are where the conventioneers got on. And I want to call your attention to kind of the lower left corner, the transfer tracks. There were nothing more than just 2 parallel tracks, one 2-foot and one dual gauge. And so to transfer coal, for example, the cars were parked side by side and hand shoveled. Nothing elaborate here, but again, it worked for the Gilpin Tram for helping carry literally millions of dollars worth of gold ore out of the out of the mines. Here's the south end of the transfer area. We see curving off on the right side the transfer area. There's no cars on it now, and that's because this photo was taken during an abandonment, sadly. But someone did take a picture, which does show the simple track arrangement. Here's the north end of the transfer yard. We see dual gauge in front, and there would have been presumably dual gauge on the other track. So Shane number 5 is getting ready to carry the looks probably another empty train of cars up to the mine, and we see an ore car hooked up behind the Shane. So off we go. The next stop was Chase Gulch, which is a very rugged climb, pretty scenic. It's kind of a, it's the gulch is canyon-like in areas, a lot of rock spires and stuff. And we're looking west kind of towards the upper end of it. I mentioned scenic. There's another photographer in the foreground there, thinks the same thing. And basically the Gilpin Tram is right above that center tree. That's the grade. And it went to kind of the upper left margin there, made a big U-turn at the head of the gulch. And let's take a look at that. This is Castle Rock, which was the head of the gulch where the Gilpin Tram ran. That's their main line down in the bottom. And you notice the main line kind of hooks to the left. Interestingly, there's a short bridge over a stream, and right below that is a waterfall. I just think that's such a cool scene. Right above it is Castle Rock, and to the right of it, the Castle Rock mine. And we see a line branching off, and that goes to the Tucker Mill, which is about a half-mile north, and you can kind of see that kind of in the right background. Now, if we look the other direction at the same location, this is Castle Rock on the left. And I think this gives a good idea of how steep the grades they were. The Gilpin Tram was not scared of grades. 4 or 5% grades, no problem. 66-foot radius curves, no problem. It was built inexpensively, but effectively. And this is a little earlier photo. That branch to the Tucker Mine branch would have been just below Castle Rock on the left, and there's no grade there yet. So this was taken a little early on in the life of the Gilpin Tram. Now, as we continue past Chase Gulch, we come to Eureka Street. Eureka Street was part of Central City proper, and it was a significant stop because Gilpin Tram had a water tank there. They had probably 2 or 3, but this is the only photo of one that has been, found. And here we see a downbound or downgrade bound train. It's loaded with ore. In the old black and white photos, the gold ore always kind of shows up as white, but I'm informed it's probably should be like a light gray color. And so the locomotive is either just stopped by the photographer or stopping for some water. You can find this location today. That triangular shaped roof right behind the train is a water reservoir that still exists. And on the left margin, you can see the Gilpin Tram bridge over Eureka Gulch, and you can find the abutments for that still, but everything else is gone. Just past the water tank, we start blasting up Prosser Gulch, and here 2 of the shays are taking a train of mostly empties. It looks like the first 3, 4 cars are loaded with coal for mines as well, but nice busy day here. That would have been one heck of a scene to have been able to see. Continuing through Prosser Gulch, we take a nice sharp hook up a nice steep grade, and we're starting to enter Gunnell Hill. Gunnell Hill was a pretty prolific mining area in its day. That mine right above the smoke was the Gold Collar, and that was served by the Gilpin Tram. It didn't have a spur. They just simply, well, it did have a spur down on the main line, but not a spur at the mine. They just must have wagon teamed the gold down to the spur and loaded it that way. And here we come to Gunnell Hill. Gunnell Hill was important, named after one of the earlier pioneers. The Gunnell Mine is kind of near left center there, the building with the 3 stacks. That was the big producer. And then kind of near top right is the Grand Army Mine. And this was actually the first mine to ship ore on the Gilpin Tram. So this is a historic area, a lot of mines there. And I took the same photo and I traced everywhere you can see a Gilpin Tram grade on those hills. There's a lot of it. In fact, going up the top of the hill there in the center, there was 7 switchbacks to reach the Hubert mine. So I'd say the Gilpin Tram was not afraid of grades and sharp curves. Often the background left is actually Quartz Hill. That's, probably over a mile away. And that was actually probably the richest mining area served by the Gilpin Tram. And we'll come to that next. But if you go look at Gunnell Hill today, this is what you see. You noticed before, there's no trees. All the trees were cut for firewood or construction. The trees are grown back, but the mine dumps are still there. And there's still a few mine ruins. So it's still worth visiting if you want to see what the Gilpin Tram was up to before. And then continuing on, the Grand Central Mine, we're all familiar with this one. This was on Gunnell Hill, and this was served by the Gilpin Tram and represented in several kits. Next, we come up to Quartz Hill. Quartz Hill had 3 different Gilpin Tram branches crisscrossing this hillside, and a good portion of those mines visible here were also served by the Gilpin Tram. Reading the newspaper account, if we were in that Democrat Party convention, we would have been greeted at many of the mines by dynamite blasts and the miners waving and so forth. So it must have been quite the scene. Nevadaville was a town located next to Quartz Hill. It wasn't directly served by the Gilpin Tram, but it was close to the mines. And so those mines up on the left were served by the Gilpin Tram. The top of the hill, Gilpin Tram climbed up there on the Quartz Hill branch. And if you go to this site today, there's about a 200-foot deep open pit from later mining operations. But again, in this photo, all those mines in the photo would have been served by spurs off the Gilpin Tram. Continuing on, we come to Russell Gulch. Russell Gulch was a town that served the local mines. It's still there today. It's not a big place, but an interesting place. The main line made a U-turn basically through the town, crossing over Russell Gulch. And here on a different day, we see one of the shays, probably number 4 or 5, taken backing down with a loaded ore train. And you can still find the remnants of the bridge today, but of course the train is long gone. But what a sight this would have been for the conventioneers. Now, so we're nearly done with our tour. We have come up the main line, and now we're coming up to Pewabic Mountain. Pewabic Mountain, a very prolific mining area, and we're going to pause for some lunches and speeches. This is an overview looking south. If you go over that mountain and down the canyon, you're in Idaho Springs. We're not that far away, but we are pretty far away railroad-wise. All the mines shown in this photo were served by the Gilpin Tram. They had spurs, like I say, all over the place. And we're gonna head out there to between what's labeled Pewabic and Lillian and pause for lunch on our imaginary tour. Along the way, there were several mines such as the Federal. This is one of the ruins surviving today. There's an ore sorting shed in front and the mine structure itself in back. I think this had a spur, but can't find any direct evidence of it, but it was certainly right next to the Gilpin Tram main line. The Old Town Mine was probably the biggest single producer on the Gilpin Tram, and this really came into being after 1900. This mine probably shipped at times 20 or more cars of ore per day. Not every day, but for big periods there. Big shipper. We see shay number 5 here on the left, pushing a couple ore cars loaded with coal, or were loaded with coal, dumping them for the boilers. And right behind it, the Old Town Mine was the Pewabic mine, kind of that odd-shaped slope structure, and the iron mine to the right of it. To the left of that is an open area. That's where we're going to pause for lunch and some speeches. And this photo, I think, could have been taken during one of the excursions, maybe the same excursion that we're on today, in our imaginary today. And here we see some, benches set up, probably 3 proud cooks there, some supplies behind them. They're getting ready for the train. Behind them, on the left side, we see left margin, the iron mine, the Pewabic mine, and then two stacks in about the center, and that's the Old Town Mine below. So things are not really all that far apart on the Gilpin Tram. A lot of activity in a small area. Here's a photo taken probably after lunch and of speeches. William Jennings Bryan did not speak here. It was some other local or state dignitaries that did that. But once they're done with that, they got back on the train. I don't know if this is the same excursion. I believe it is, and I think this was taken at Pewabic Mountain, and we see the conventioneers apparently loading back up for a scenic overlook. The scenic overlook occurred at the Frontenac mine, and this mine here was original end of track. It was a steady producer and shipped quite regularly on the Gilpin Tram. We see an ore car being loaded beneath the chute lower right corner. If you go there today, the mine ruins are still there. Of course, the track is long gone. Since I took this photo, some local group has stabilized the structure even more. So there's a nice little hiking trail. You can get to it, public access, if you care to see it. What the conventioneers did in 1908 was to pause at the track somewhere here at the Frontenac mine and overlook South Willis Gulch. They're looking east at kind of a nice scenic view. Doesn't look like much here. Here's how the view looks today. This was the end of the excursion. This is the end of our excursion today. And I hope you enjoyed the trip just as the conventioneers enjoyed the trip back in 1908. So thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you, Keith. That was great. We're running a little late. I've got a couple comments from the people. First of all, Jim Curran said the Colorado Midland Museum, the Colorado Railroad Museum, has the diamond stack off the wreck of the Shea number 3 in 1897. Last I heard, it was sitting in the weeds in back of somewhere. It used to be out on display.
Last time I saw it, it was backed by a bunch of switch stands, kind of, if when you pull in the parking lot, it's kind of like straight ahead of you or to the west. But yeah, it's a flattened piece of metal, but it's a Gilpin Tram locomotive artifact. Yeah, Jim, you're right. It's neat. Just something like that even exists.
Dan Stanger said, enjoyed the presentation. What was the name of the book on the left and the picture of the 3 books?
The book on the left was the Gilpin Railroad Era. It was Sundance Publications' last book, and it's still available.
Good. Steve Hollenbeck says, great presentation, Keith. And Jim Brown said, really enjoyed this. With that, we'll move on, Keith. Thanks a lot for a wonderful presentation.